Hello and welcome. Welcome to United View and welcome to the Tactical View. We're going through the previous game, Manchester United against Southampton. I, myself, Marcel here. Today, I have Cams with me, the genius that is, the tactical man, knows everything about tactics when it comes to Manchester United. And I would just love you to show me how the game was affected tactically against Southampton.
So, look, first thing to say, it may not have been the best game. Obviously, the red card sort of ruined it, going down to 10 men. But in this game, we saw a glimpse into the future under Erik ten Hag. We saw use of a very different principle to something that we've seen before. And I think for that reason, tactically, this is a really interesting game to break down. So, as much as sort of the result may not have been the best, it maybe wasn't the best watch for the last sort of hour or so. But today's show should be a good one because there's a lot to get into. So, without any further ado, once the screen pops up, we'll have a little look at the Southampton team, as we normally do. That's how we normally start these shows. And you can see the shape when they had the ball's more of a 4-2-3-1 shape, with Alcaraz playing in behind Che Adams there. In terms of other notable players, look, they're bottom of the league for a reason. There's not an awful lot of quality in that team. I think Walker-Peters is a decent player. Ward-Prowse, obviously, we know his threat from dead balls, and I think everybody knows that, and he's quite mobile. Lavia is probably one of the players that a lot of people are looking at to pick up if they do go down, although City apparently have got a buyback clause on him, so maybe that won't happen. Bella Kotchap as well, decent centre-back, obviously, left-footed as well, which is quite helpful. Perrault at left-back I quite like. But yeah, so I think that's about as much as we can really say about this team. There's not a lot of quality, not a lot else to really talk about. Theo Walcott,
Bit of pace, counter-attacking.
Yeah, what's Walcott still doing on a Premier League football pitch? I've got no idea. But yeah, so that's their in-possession shape. Is more of a 4-2-3-1 with Alcaraz behind Che Adams. But out of possession, which is where the majority of this tactical view is going to be, with United having the ball, Southampton trying to defend. A lot of it was in more of a 4-4-2 shape with Alcaraz pushing up to join Che Adams. So that's worth bearing in mind as we go into what comes next, is that Southampton spent most of the time out of possession in a 4-4-2. So what I now want to do is bring it on to what was happening when Southampton were pressing high, because the United team selection here, which you can see was a little bit unusual. I think a lot of people were surprised potentially at the start by the inclusion of both Jadon Sancho and Bruno Fernandes. What did you make of that team news when you first saw it? Because it does look quite attacking on paper, doesn't it?
Yeah, honestly, Cam, ultra-attacking kind of style. And really interesting to see, Bruno Fernandes and Jadon Sancho in those central areas. I didn't think, that they combined well, but it was really exciting. Ultra-attacking kind of style team there. But do Jadon Sancho and Bruno Fernandes combine well, in that area? We didn't get to see much of it, but...
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, but I think the reason that Bruno and Jadon Sancho were both playing in this game was Erik ten Hag's game plan. Now, Southampton press high, and in recent games, United have really struggled against teams that press high, so we had to come up with a different way to try and play out from the back and beat the press. And that different way is why we had Jadon Sancho and why we had Bruno Fernandes, and why also we saw quite often Rashford and Antony staying really high, whilst Weghorst was sort of dropping in a little bit to try and link in midfield. And that's why Casemiro was so crucial in the early stages. He got on the ball a lot of times, and he was able to find some nice switches, but also lost the ball a few times as well. But all of this, in terms of the different organisation in midfield, was down to Ten Hag's game plan and the way he wanted to play out from the back, which is something different to what we've seen before and different to what a lot of other teams do. And the reason it was different, as we now I'll bring up the board with both teams on it, and the reason it's a little bit different with what we've seen is because most teams, when they're building up, is what they try and do is have an extra player, a numerical advantage against the first line of the press. So, for example, if let's say we're United, we're playing against a team with two strikers, maybe we'd drop Casemiro in between the centre-backs to give us a 3v2, or against one striker, you'd leave your two centre-backs back and maybe get them to split a little bit wider, just so you've got that 2v1 in the first line. But that isn't what happened with for United against Southampton, and that was why Jadon Sancho and Bruno Fernandes both played. So, what we typically see is when we're playing out from the back, as we've said, Southampton sort of set up in this 4-4-2 out of possession. And what that meant was that for the United back line, they all had a direct opponent. So against Luke Shaw, you had Walcott just sort of locking onto him, Adams on Martinez, Alcaraz on Varane, and Sulemana on Wan-Bissaka. So what that means is that it's actually really difficult to get the ball into that defensive line because obviously everyone's got a direct opponent.
Yeah.
And that means also if any of our back four players receive the ball, they're under immense pressure immediately. And the other thing that Southampton did quite well in this press is that the strikers were very keen and very careful to keep Casemiro in their shadow, so that if they were going to, for example, if they're pressing Varane here, Alcaraz is always between the ball and Casemiro to stop us being able to get that ball into Casemiro and playing out through the middle early.
Cutting off the passing lanes.
Exactly, and that's really important because obviously in a 4-4-2 compared to a 4-3-3, which we had. The area where we have the extra player is that midfield, because obviously there's 3 players there versus the Southampton 2 players. So it was important that the strikers screened that ball into Casemiro to stop us getting that ball into that area where we had the overload. But what was so key from Ten Hag is that rather than dropping Casemiro in here to create that 3v2 situation, which, and look, the downside of doing that is that yes, it's easier to retain the ball here possibly, but in that midfield area, your advantage of having that extra player is gone because you've dropped them into a deeper line. So what we saw instead from Erik Ten Hag was, rather than relying on a numerical advantage, there's different sorts of advantages you can rely on in football. So obviously there's numerical is one, as we've mentioned, that a lot of teams rely on. You can also have a physical superiority or a physical advantage. So if you've got maybe a player that's 6'6" against, let's say you put Wout Weghorst up against Tariq Lamptey, you're going to expect Weghorst to probably win everything in the air. That sort of thing. So there's a physical advantage. You've also got a technical advantage if you've got players that are much better technically than your opposition. So let's say in a particular area of the pitch, it's a 3v3 situation, but the players on one team are much better technically. They can just zip it round the other 3 players in the opposition. But what we went for in this situation was something that you can call a dynamic superiority. So it was emphasis on rotations in particular areas. Right. So rather than having an extra number, what we tried to do was, when this sort of situation was arising, we would see often one of the fullbacks, typically Wan-Bissaka, dropping off really deep to pick up the ball from De Gea, knowing that obviously in the first instance, Sulemana is not going to follow him yet. But once that ball goes out, you would see Sulemana follow Wan-Bissaka. Once the ball's out, that was the trigger. As soon as it gets out to Wan-Bissaka, him dropping in makes it easy for De Gea to find that ball out, and then that triggers the press. That was what Ten Hag was trying to do. We know Southampton are a good team in the press. The idea was we trigger the press and we try to outplay it, not using an extra number, but by using combinations and rotations. And that is why we saw Bruno Fernandes and Jadon Sancho. Because, for example, if we tried to play out down this right-hand side, what we'd see is Sulemana would be initially sitting between the ball and Antony, so there's no ball on down the line. Our plan to play out from the back then, what it then involved was Jadon Sancho dropping into these areas here, and that would draw in Lavia. And because Wan-Bissaka was on the ball, once Sulemana went in and engaged in the press, Perraud followed him every time. So what we'd see there every single time was that actually, rather than having the extra man to play out, we had one man fewer. So Southampton had a 3v2 in this area, which means obviously, whilst it's 11v11, if you've got an extra player somewhere, you've got one less player somewhere else. And the key point here is that with Sancho and Wan-Bissaka being able to combine and play one-touch passing, we had something similar, a similar dynamic on the left with Bruno and Luke Shaw. What that meant was that because Perraud had stepped up, Antony was suddenly in space here. With Bella Kotchap tucking around, you had Bednarek tucking around, you had Walker-Peters tucking around. But the idea was pretty simple in that if we can combine quickly, use dynamism with it. So Sancho, Wan-Bissaka would maybe play it into Sancho, bounce it straight off to Wan-Bissaka, one-touch stuff. The idea was that once you built through, once you've broken the press in that area, Casemiro was then free, because then you've advanced up the pitch, broken the press. These guys are no longer able to influence the game because they're still pressing the centre-backs to prevent that ball back in, which means that Casemiro is then free in midfield. So that's where the advantage of not having Casemiro in the back line, which would have given you an extra number, is so important, because now he's the free man in midfield. And the genius from this sort of idea, rather than having the extra man, is that it gives us more players on the opposite side of the pitch. So what it meant was we were able to combine in these areas, get that ball into Casemiro, and on the opposite side of the pitch, because Casemiro wasn't here, meaning Bruno would have to come in here, we had Casemiro in these areas to find those passes. Bruno will be in here able to attack, Rashford will be able to attack, and all of a sudden you're overloading the defence in the opposite side of the pitch. So it's a principle that not many teams use because it's so difficult to get right, because look, inevitably, if you're playing with less players in that area to try and beat the press, you're relying on technical security, you're relying on the combinations being crisp, not giving the ball away. But that's why we had Sancho and Bruno there rather than other players, rather than like a Fred or a McTominay, who maybe are probably a little bit more sloppy in those areas. So it was a nice idea, and what it meant was that a lot of times Casemiro was able to switch the play, and on the opposite side we'd have that overload. We'd often have Luke Shaw making an underlapping run as well. So we're able to switch the play and get out. So we'd beat the press in one area, suck the defence in, and obviously Southampton are fairly well coached, to be fair to them, to the point where once they've engaged in this area, this happens. They narrow off really well. Obviously defenders tuck round as well, and normally backline step up as well. But that's why we had Antony and Rashford playing in those positions rather than Rashford through the middle, was that we had Bruno and Rashford on the opposite side of the pitch here. We had Antony able to break in behind. So the idea was that by having fewer players here, we'd create more space elsewhere on the pitch and have the numbers to exploit it. It was fantastic from Erik Ten Hag, and it's a look to the future for United. Rather than, and look, We've talked a lot on past tactical views about how out of possession, United set up to have lots of 1v1 battles, lots of situations where players are marked tightly in midfield. So when we're pressing, our 8s are really high on the deepest opposition midfield players to set up 1v1 duels and set up transitional situations from that. This is doing the same in possession. Because it's so dependent on 1 and 2 touch play, we're essentially creating like a mini transition situation where if we beat the press with combinations here, the defence are disorganised because they're in pressing mode and there's space elsewhere to exploit.
We're stretching the opposition's space, the opposition's shape, because we're asking them to come across the pitch. And like you said, there's 3 players out wide. We saw as well, in the first half, a lot of good switches from Luke Shaw as well, freeing up Anthony as well. So is that a thing that we should be continuing to work on, or was it something that changes in between game?
Yeah, I think it's different. Obviously, different. It's horses for courses, isn't it? You want a different way to play against different opponents. I think the downside of doing this, relying on rotations rather than just sort of dropping Casemiro into the back line, for example, is that if you drop Casemiro into the back line, you end up with a more controlled state of the game because you've got that advantage there the entire time. Yeah. So it makes it easier to circulate that ball sideways until there's an opportunity to pass it forwards. And then with Casemiro in there, you can then push your fullbacks really high up the pitch, both sides, which pins back the wingers on either side. So this is an example of what that would look like, for example, there. So you've got that back 3 that you form by dropping Casemiro in. And because then you've had that back 3, you can push your fullbacks really high up the pitch, drop your wingers in narrower. And what that means is, obviously, it's easier to circulate the ball here until you find an opportunity to pass forwards. And if you can pass the ball forward, even if you can't pass the ball forwards, you've got these sort of overloads here, potentially with one of the 8s joining as well, so a 3v2 in that situation. Yeah. So that makes it more controlled, and that's what maybe we'll see in future years when United are more able to, maybe this is harsh, but we've got a lot of players at the moment who struggle to play out of a high press under control, and I think with the midfield situation we've got, maybe Casemiro is not the best in really tight spaces. So maybe going forward, that's something we look at against different opponents. But for this game, it was nice to see that we've identified that Southampton are probably weak in those situations where their press gets broken, and that's why we focused on doing that, trying to bait their press and break it down the sides before transferring it out elsewhere.
I think we really missed Eriksen. Eriksen seems like someone that brings that kind of control.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what we saw is that when Bruno was dropping in on this side, so we'll go back to the shape that we were. We played this sort of back 4 with the fullbacks coming really deep to receive the ball off De Gea to try and bait the press, as we said. And obviously on the right side it was Sancho dropping in, on the left side it was Bruno. Now Bruno he had a lot of moments where in these sorts of positions he picked up the ball or he rotated with Luke Shaw. Luke Shaw came into these areas instead and Bruno would almost play as a fullback. Yeah. He would lose the ball a little bit too much on the edge of our box. That's why if you got someone like Frankie de Jong in, a player who's that much better technically, it makes the world of difference.
So in terms of Rashford's involvement and how he played, how do you think, because he wasn't effective, the wingers throughout the whole game were ineffective. Anthony he held the ball well, but wasn't effective. How could they have changed their style or the shape of the team? Ten Hag unfortunately had to take out Weghorst in the second half.
Yes.
But how do we get the strikers or more players in the box?
Yeah, so what I want to talk about then is, after the red card, as you say, so I think that gives Ten Hag a really difficult decision because obviously our game plan and the way we're trying to play is obviously draw in the press down one flank and then switch the play out to the opposite side. So for me, I think that's why we saw Jadon Sancho go into the number 9 role, and it was Weghorst sacrificed, wasn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah.
And I think the reason that, I think what he was trying to achieve with that, let me find Scott McTominay, there he is. I think what he was trying to achieve with that is that we keep sort of the idea of having the 8s either side to combine to try and draw in the press either side, then play out to the opposite side. But obviously what we lose is that free man in the midfield here. Yeah. So if we're sort of, what we were trying to do with the switch of play is that once the press has been drawn, let's just get them up the pitch, is that we'll have Rashford and Bruno on the opposite side, or we'll have Sancho and Anthony down this side. But once that red card happens, Bruno's got to come in here then to receive that ball inside once the press has been broken by McTominay and Wan-Bissaka, meaning that then there's only a 1v1 duel for Rashford rather than having a 2v1 on the opposite side, which made it that much harder. But I think it was, once the red card happened, it was a decision for Ten Hag as to whether he wanted to keep trying to play the same way in terms of the same principles that the team had worked on, had discussed, of breaching the press down one flank, then switching the play, in which case it made sense to have Anthony and Rashford staying on the wings, or it might have been a better decision rather than having Sancho up top, just to put Rashford through the middle and just play more direct. I think we really struggled with Sancho up top.
Yeah, I mean, directness is like a really good feature of both Bruno and Rashford's game. Rashford is a kind of like last man striker, likes to break the lines. Bruno really struggled, in terms of he was giving away the ball a lot as a single eight. Do you think we would see him, or was he good as an eight?
I think it depends on the game. What I want to highlight actually is just to sort of bring a little bit more clarity to the role of Bruno and Sancho. We can have a little look at some of the some heat maps here. So what you can see, which is probably unusual for Bruno and Sancho's game, Sancho obviously there's probably a little bit more stuff on the left after he went up front later on in the game, that sort of stuff. But what you can see is the amount of activity quite deep here on the right side. You can see how involved he was in build-up in the early sort of stages of us building out from the back. And that really speaks to his role. And the same with Bruno here, in that Bruno had a lot of deep involvement here with us trying to play out from the back. So you can really see in those heat maps how our instructions are maybe different and the approach was different to what we've seen in a lot of games. And as to whether we see more of that from Bruno going forward, I don't think it's his best role. But what I think is happening is that Ten Hag has realised if we're trying to build out from the back, Casemiro is not great under high pressure. He's not. You give him time and space, he can pick out a pass. But under intense pressure, he's not the guy that's going to break lines. He's not that press resistant, and you can't play Fred alongside him in that situation. And for me, I think that's why against Betis we saw Bruno in the deeper role, because he's better on the ball, not perfect, but more able to pick out passes, a little bit more press resistant than Fred. And then we had Fred a bit higher up, which helped us with the press. Basically, I think Ten Hag's got to a point where he can't have Fred close to goal. It's a situation where he's told Fred, look, when we're building up, get as high up the pitch as you possibly can. Get away from our own goal. I don't want to see you giving the ball away near our own goal. And at the moment, it's Bruno who's dropping back in there. I hope Sabitzer's back soon because we need him or we need Christian Eriksen in there, because having that security in the deep area is the difference between us doing what we're doing at the moment with moderate success and us being able to do it with a lot more success. And that's sort of, in the meantime now, whilst we're sort of still learning as a team, we haven't had enough time to work on that building out phase yet. So this is the heat maps here. We'll have a quick look at the play areas as well, which sort of makes a similar point in terms of how much we tried to play out down the sides, either side, rather than through the middle, which again is because with those two strikers pressing, Southampton made it really hard for us to get the ball straight into Casemiro from early when we're building out from the back. So you can see the combinations here, particularly here, deep on the right side. That's where Wan-Bissaka and Sancho early on were finding their joy, where Wan-Bissaka and McTominay afterwards were finding their joy. And that's sort of, I think it's important to bear this in mind in terms of the statistical implications, and I think that gives us further proof of, or further evidence to support the way we're trying to play. And yeah, we'll go back to the screen. But yes, so what did you make of the substitution? What do you make of Scott McTominay's performance?
I think it was very brave. He made big, important challenges at times. I don't think technically he was very secure with the ball. A little bit wasteful as well. I think everyone across the whole board, we're talking about control without Eriksen, just the general in the middle areas of the park. There's not much security. Like you said, it's been shadow covered by the two forward players, so difficult to make anything happen in there. Yeah. But I don't think he was brilliantly on the ball.
And for me, it goes back to what we said at the very start, is that with a 4-3-3 against a 4-4-2, the area where you've got that extra player is the midfield. Yeah. And as soon as Casemiro got sent off, what you end up with here is Bruno and McTominay up against Lavia and Ward-Prowse. So actually, it's pretty much every player's marked. Yeah. It's even with Sancho in this role, even if he dropped in a little bit, it's difficult to find him. And it means that if McTominay goes wide to combine, Bruno has a choice to make. Either he comes and sits in the middle and waits for that sort of ball back inside after we've hopefully broken the press, or in which case if he's in the middle, he's not there for the switch of play, which means it's a tough job for Rashford because he's up against Walker-Peters who has to slow him down. Ward-Prowse will be back on the cover, Bednarek's back on the cover without anyone else to really worry about. No. And if Bruno makes the other choice to go and stand with Rashford, hoping that McTominay is able to both partake in those combinations and also switch the play himself, if we do lose the ball, donut formation. Yeah. There's nothing in the middle. Yeah. We're in big trouble. Yeah. So that's the difficult situation that we were thrust into after the red card. What I would have liked to see done a little bit differently in terms of managing the game is possibly just a bit more presence up front. I think even if it was just from goal kicks, I would have quite liked to see Scott McTominay come and stand up here, just for some hope of competing for a first ball to try and get us up the pitch. Because I thought we were having real problems actually playing out from the back because of the way Southampton pressed, and obviously with a man less, it's impossible to move the ball forward. Yeah. It was tough, and we didn't have any threat from direct play, long balls. It was a difficult situation where I think when you go down to 10 men, you've got to change the way you're trying to play. If it's reliant on combinations and finding a free man somewhere after those combinations, the free man disappears, you've got problems. So I would have liked to see maybe Ten Hag get a few more ball carries onto the pitch. Maybe Diogo Dalot, Palistra and Garnacho a little bit early on, I think, because they're good ball carriers. They can commit 2 or 3 players, and that's when you can then try and find the free man somewhere else. I think that's the difficulty for me.
I was thinking maybe, just on what you were saying there, changing it maybe to a 3-2-5, or trying to get some player outside of the defensive line, higher up the pitch, maybe into the midfield areas, maybe into the forward areas. I mean, the defense was brilliant. Martinez was really good, but could he have maybe altered the shape a little bit differently?
Yeah, I think so. I think when you do go a man light, I think that's the situation where maybe it would have been the right decision to maybe McTominay or Bruno to get them dropping into these, maybe in that situation there. So at least we've got a 3v2 in the first phase. Yeah. It gives us an area of the pitch where we can at least try and circulate the ball and retain it, and then move the ball, build slowly from there. Whereas I think we really struggled to get a foothold in the game, and yeah, we had chances from the odd set piece, and we did work a few things nicely, but I think that's something we probably should have seen. Yes, I agree.
Weghorst, had a little bit of a cameo. Unfortunately, got taken off early. But how did his role in the game affect the team?
Yes. So this is something I want to show you. So I've got here a little sequence, something similar to what I was talking about earlier. So we'll start off with Martinez dropping the ball off to De Gea, and as we mentioned, this is again an overview of how United tried to play with Wan-Bissaka dropping in. You can see the Southampton players again. Look, Wan-Bissaka comes really deep to try and bait the press up. You can see the Southampton players locking on there. But again, importantly, they're between the ball and Casemiro, so it's really difficult to find Casemiro early. And what you see then, the press gets baited. Sulemana comes in, Sancho drops in to try and combine. Lavia comes across, Perro steps up as well. We've drawn the players in. We play that combination there into Sancho. He maybe, obviously the back four shifts across, Ward-Prowse comes across, Sancho bounces it off back to Wan-Bissaka. Wan-Bissaka finds it into Casemiro, and this is the situation here where in some situations it'll be, obviously you've got Bruno and Rashford there, meaning that Ward-Prowse has got a decision to make. He either goes and tries to press Casemiro, in which case Bruno's free or Rashford's free very easily, gives Walker-Peters a 2v1, or in some situations as well, Weghorst was able to drop in there, which drags Bednarek away. Either Weghorst's a free man if he drops in there, or if Bednarek comes with him, there's space for Bruno and Rashford to attack. So that was the idea, was that Weghorst was going to be a link player in that situation. He wasn't there to offer a lot else, really. That wasn't the game plan for Wout Weghorst. He was just there to link play in those situations because we were trying to switch it as early as possible. So the idea for him wasn't really to have that much threat of his own. It was just to link play, be a nuisance, drag the defenders away so that Rashford and Antony on either flank had space to create, space to sort of take on that man in 1v1 situation. So that was the role of Wout Weghorst. On this situation, he didn't sort of drop in, but the ball gets switched out to Rashford. And from that situation, most of the time you back Rashford to do something. Yeah. If he doesn't, he's got Luke Shaw coming forward on the underlap as well. I think that was the game plan, and that's where Wout Weghorst could have had some involvement, but unfortunately with the red card, it changed the game.
Yeah, took him off early, unfortunately. I do feel like he had 1 or 2 opportunities, a header opportunity and stuff like that.
The header, having watched it back, I think he just didn't expect it to come to him. There's a defender right in front of him. He thought he was going to get a header on it. I think maybe the defender got a little bit of a nick on the ball, and that probably put Weghorst off, but yeah, a couple of half chances.
Yeah. So that's all we have time for now. Please comment in the section below. Is Cam right on certain things? Dynamic superiority, shape, moving the balance of the team and the opposition shape across the pitch. But comment on the section below. We'll see you in the next one. Thursday, big game against Real Betis. Another tactical view. Looking forward to that and to see how we shape up in the next game. So see you guys later and peace.